Jeff, welcome back to part two of a very important episode. I'm excited. The first part we discussed, which I think this is the first time I ever told anybody that they need to see it before watching this episode. The first part was called The First Part of Quantum of Money, QE, Repo, and Niels Bohr. Now we're the second part of the Quantum of Money, Results from the Triparty Repo Experiment, both posted on the 1st of June at Alhambra Investments. And we left off talking about, did I already mention in this part that at the end of this episode, we're going to be talking about a new way, a way that maybe it's not new. I know, Jeff, at the beginning of before the show started, you say, well, it's not new, but I've not seen it discussed anywhere else. I think it'll be new to our audience of how to measure the shadow monetary system. One aspect, we can't measure it in totality, but we can get a sense from this new measure and combine it with some of the other ones that we've discussed previously. Back to the show.
Before we go, let's expound upon that point a little bit more. What we're talking about is, as we said in part one, tri-party repo. Now, tri-party repo is what happens where a repo borrower and a cash lender and a collateral supplier get together using a custodian bank, and it's all it's all happens transparently. Usually on the books of that custodian, or the custodian's arranging for all of these things to happen. But that's not the full extent of the quote-unquote repo market either. Much, if not the majority of repo, actually takes place outside of that context in bilateral arrangements, which means you don't go to JP Morgan in the morning and arrange a repo, or in the afternoon and arrange a repo transaction. You call somebody and directly and just engage in a transaction one-to-one. That's a bilateral arrangement that doesn't really show up anywhere except upon your books and the counterparty's books. And if we're talking about, of course, foreign banks engaging with other foreign banks, and U.S. systems data collection efforts may not show up anywhere. So much of the repo market is truly shadow stuff. It's the tri-party repo market that we have the most ability to observe, because the Federal Reserve Bank of New York requires these custodians to report to them what's going on in their tri-party repo book. And this is more recent stuff, but it has been, they've been required to report for a long time. We're just now getting more access to what goes on in tri-party repo. But going back to Niels Bohr and what we talked about in part one, we're still not getting the entire picture. And so we have to keep in mind that even this experiment, as we get even more complicated and bring more elements to it, it's still not the full extent of what goes on in the repo market. And so we're in danger. We have to keep in mind we're making assumptions. What we see in tri-party repo can tell us something important about what must be going on outside of tri-party repo in the bilateral hidden repo market, which we can't really know for sure. And so going back to Niels Bohr, totality of phenomena, we're trying to match this better view of what we think is reality with other sorts of data, including real-time pricing mechanisms and things like that, to try to come up with a comprehensive picture of what must be going on in a complex system that, as Bohr said, may be just beyond our ability to simply comprehend. And it's an important task, and it's a really important thing since 2008. But we have to bear in mind that all of these limitations that make it much more difficult to do. That said, we're going to do it anyway, because there really isn't much choice.
Wonderful. Yeah, gathering multiple independent points of view, of perspectives on something, and then seeing if they agree. That's something that Daniel Want often talks about. Maybe we should talk to him soon. Okay, let us look. I'm going to read a few lines here, and then we're going to continue our experiment. So there are groupings of securities over which the bank has varying degrees of control. Some outright purchases, some are shorted, some are borrowed, others themselves part of complex iterations like transformation, pledged in one of several securities financing transactions, not just repo, but also any other subset via derivatives. It's a blending of assets against a blending of liabilities. If, stretching our example a bit further, a bank has pledged 4 types of assets. So here's our next experiment or example. Where are you going with this, with the 4 assets?
Yeah, we started with the simple thought experiments, which was a single repo transaction where a bank buys a treasury, which means establish full title and ownership over it in the morning, incurs a daylight overdraft, and at the end of the day goes in the repo market and closes out all its obligations. Now, what we're going to do is what we hope is a step more realistic, which is realize that banks aren't just running single transactions. They're not filling out a portfolio one asset at a time. They have thousands upon thousands of assets to manage. They have competing desks and competing mandates that are often doing different things at different times. And so they essentially have an ocean of assets to match against an ocean of liability choices and try to manage both risks as well as return to get the most efficient use out of both sides of their balance sheets. In our less simplistic example that we're going to go to here, we'll imagine that a bank has 4 different types of collateral. I think I started with an off-the-run treasury note, an on-the-run treasury bill, a corporate junk bond, and what was the other one?
MBS. Agency MBS.
Agency MBS, of course. How could I forget the Fannie and Freddie? So we have all of those 4 types of collateral that we're going to use in not 4 different repo transactions, but wouldn't it make sense to have a single repo transaction? So you go to JP Morgan, I say, I have these assets on my books. I want to pledge them in repo because I need financing on my balance sheet. I need to balance assets and liabilities. And I'm going to pledge these 4 types of assets because of various different reasons that we couldn't even begin to describe. And that's what happens. You have a single repo transaction that might be backed by 4 different types of collateral, each one giving a different haircut because they represent different risks to the cash lender. And it's sort of a blended transaction that more accurately captures what really goes on in these places.
What would happen, for example, if the off-the-run treasury starts to become a little bit more illiquid than it normally is? Or if the near junk corporate bond becomes nearer junk corporate debt? What happens then?
Actually, the next day when the repo transactions unwind, JP Morgan might say, before we get to repo for today, I'm going to need some adjustment in the collateral. You need to put up more of something else, maybe more of the on-the-run treasury bill rather than off-the-run treasury note. Or if maybe you've already over-collateralized. You've pledged more collateral to JP Morgan than you need, and so you're okay. And so JP Morgan just simply says, hey, you're in danger of using up your over-collateralization because we're no longer seeing that off-the-run treasury the same way we did yesterday. We're not giving you the same amount of full par value in the repo, this blended repo transaction, because the haircut has been perceived to be a little bit higher given the liquidity risk that we're seeing in the marketplace. So the idea is to protect all parties are trying to protect themselves. But it's a dynamic world where things change all the time. And if you have 4 different types of collateral, you can expect at times that at least one of those forms of collateral is going to the terms upon that you're using with it are going to be changed on you without you knowing ahead of time. And then you have to do something else.
And what if I say, well, dear JP Morgan, we go back so long, we're friends. Let me give you more junk corporate bonds. Won't that make you happy? Won't that over collateralize it? And they said, we're not interested in just taking any more. We need liquid on the run treasuries or agency MBS. And Jeff, what happens if I don't have that? That's not available, and I'm not the only one dealing with JP Morgan. They're giving that call to lots of people, and there's a scramble for these liquid assets.
If you're not over collateralized, your over collateralization gets used up and the haircuts change more extreme than you expect, you're right, you have to do something else. And what JP Morgan says, well, we may be friends, but friends operate in the federal funds market, not in the repo market. This is the cold business of repo here, okay. Which means we can have a drink afterwards, but you're going to post collateral. I'm going to kill your operation. This is what happened in Bear Stearns and AIG and Lehman Brothers and all those 2008 examples where JP Morgan said, I need more collateral or I'm going to shut you out of the tri-party repo system. Because remember, again, as we said in part 1, as tri-party repos, the guy is the bank that's extending these daylight overdrafts and allowing the system to work the way it has. at the end of the day, if I don't post enough collateral, I can't balance my liabilities with the assets that I've obtained. That means I'm cash deficient with JP Morgan, which means JP Morgan is on the hook for what I'm doing. And they really don't want to do that. They don't want to be in that kind of a situation. So they're going to demand, before you run out of collateral, we're seeing the changes in collateral terms all over the place. Before you run out, you better post more good collateral or we're going to shut you out and effectively put you out of business. And so that's where, okay, now I've got the call from JP Morgan, which means by the end of the day, I've got to find some usable collateral somewhere, somehow. Obviously, I can't just go out and buy it because I don't have the cash to do it. So I'm going to have to put together some form, usually some complicated number of transactions, whether I can arrange some kind of securities financing where I can borrow treasuries from someplace else who will lend them to me on hopefully my junk bond collateral. So maybe I can swap out the junk corporates that I've been using with this blended repo transaction and tri-party repo. I can use that as a collateral in a securities transformation where I'm getting back treasury bond or treasury on the run treasury notes or bills that I've now borrowed, that I can swap those out into this blended repo transaction just to maintain the same level of repo financing as I had yesterday. So it's not like I'm gaining anything here. I'm just trying to stay afloat by managing all of these collateral liabilities.
And I think you would be able to during a reflation, because maybe it was just some idiosyncratic problem. Somebody drank the wrong cup of coffee and they're putting pressure on your hedge fund or your pension fund or whatever it happens to be. But during a euro-dollar crisis, if you're in a silent depression, if you're in a monetary euro-dollar famine, then everyone's getting that call at the same time and there's not enough collateral for everyone to make good. And so what we see...
or at the very least, the price of usable collateral starts to go up. Again, it's typical inelasticity. It really, when you think about collateral in terms of very currency-like properties, when it becomes inelastic, just like money, in the Great Depression, for example, the price of money went sky high because it became hard to currency became very inelastic. And as you see the same thing happen in collateral, it exhibits these currency-like properties where when it's in short supply, the price goes through the roof. And what we're really talking about here is treasury bills. That's why we see, March of last year, the price of treasury bills, especially during the most illiquid periods, especially during these periods where repo transactions were on everybody's mind. Everybody was getting the call from tri-party repo custodians, and the prices of treasury bills would skyrocket through the roof because everybody was herded into that one asset class because the rest of the market started to break down and everybody started to look at all these other types of collateral very differently than they had the day before or the week before or the month before.
I'm going to pull up some graphs now, but the 2 points that we just raised, one, during reflation, you should see a dispersion of eligible collateral because everything's going fine. Argentinian sovereign bonds, no problem. Emerging market corporate bonds, no problem because it's rainbows, sunshine, the world's recovering.
Risk-taking, right?
Yeah.
Reflation is essentially a risk-on period. Now, it's a modest risk-on period compared to, say, before 2008. But that's really it is. It's a risk-taking behavior. What you're showing here is the data that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York provides on the tri-party repo market, provided to them from the call reports given by JP Morgan and Bank of New York. What you're seeing here isn't a sample. As the FRBNY data makes clear, this is it. This is everything that has gone on, or at least everything that's been recorded and reported in the tri-party repo market. But remember, as we said before, this is only tri-party repo and not the entire repo market, so we're already limited in that respect. But still, here is a complete data source on tri-party repo in the U.S. And the two lines we're showing here are two different data points that the FRBNY collects. There are the number of repos, which, as it says, the number of repo transactions in any given time period, the amount that are just simply tallied up. And then there's the number of observations for those repo transactions. As you can see, there's more observations, more data points than there are number of repos.
Let's stop. What is number of observations? How is that different from number of repos? Sounds similar.
because as you know, as a database, you're reporting into a database, the number of repo transactions might have more than one collateral type associated with it. So a single repo may have more than one observation because there are several different pieces of collateral posted in that single repo transaction. As we just were talking about, these blended repo transactions, where banks post more than one type of collateral to secure a single financing arrangement.
Well, looking at that graph, nothing jumps out at me. So you transformed it with a very complex mathematical transformation called divided by. What do we see now?
So we take the number of observations divided by the number of repos, and what we find is that, as you're just talking about, Emil, during reflationary periods, there tends to be more number of observations per repo transaction than otherwise. And what that says, as you just pointed out, it indicates, or it implies, that banks in the repo market are pledging more different types of collateral per repo transaction than they had been, during these Eurodollar periods where we have observed repeatedly the repo market gets herded into a narrower subset. So reflation, risk-taking, more types of collateral gets used to secure individual repo transactions, and then that process somewhat reverses where it really narrows down into the most usable forms of collateral. And it's just constant back and forth, one to the other, one to the other.
So if I'm looking at this graph, I see 3 Eurodollar crises, because I guess we didn't have the data for the first one, right?
Right.
So Eurodollar number 2, what we see is the line going down, flat to down. Eurodollar number 3, flat to down. Eurodollar 4, flat to down. Reflation 2 and 3, straight up to the moon. Jeff, we are supposed to be in a reflation right now, after the corona. That's not what we see. What we see is continuing Eurodollar 4 after kind of a break, Eurodollar 4B. This, if you ask this chart would say we are not recovering. We're not reflating.
Right, and that's the idea here is that especially the Federal Reserve since March 2020, in particular, making a big emphasis of quote unquote bailing out the corporate bond market. We think that part of the market, which I believe was a huge part. I mean, again, we don't know exactly what collateral was pledged when and where. The tri-party repo data does give us some sense of the different types of collateral, but we don't know exactly and specifically how they're pledged at what different periods of time. But we would think since March of 2020, with the Federal Reserve bailing out corporate bonds, we might see another leg up in this, in our measure here, our derived measure of observations per repo, which would suggest the collateral list is relaxing, it's expanding, more different types of collateral being used in the tri-party repo market. And that's not what we see. We see where, again, it looks more like we're still being stuck to a narrowed collateral list in usable repo transactions, at least in tri-party repo.
It's, keeping Niels Bohr in mind and Heisenberg, we don't have the full picture, but this experiment so far is damning for reflation 4B or 3, 4, I don't know which one we're on. Okay, now another data set. Jeff, what are we looking at here?
Now we're going to look at the total market value or dollar volume of collateral pledged in repo. And this is where we break it down by some collateral types to give you a sense of what happens during these times. So even during, as we said before, this Eurodollar number 4 period, which goes back to the end of 2017, so the number of observations per repo declined slightly, which meant less and less collateral dispersion, more collateral that's more singular types of collateral being used. The dollar volume of repo, tri-party repo during that period sort of skyrocketed. It went way up, and it went way up because tri-party repo was demanding mostly additional treasuries being posted, as well as some agency MBS, some of the best types of collateral in the system, in order to get this dollar volume to go way up. And so the question is why? What was going on in 2018 and 2019 that meant repo dollar volume had to go sky high, but only with this narrow collateral list?
do we have anything to, looking at the 2020 post-corona time period, are we getting a different message here that reflation is taking place?
Yeah, that is somewhat reflationary because remember, we look at the repo market, especially in dollar volume, as the actual lender of last resort. And we've talked about this many times before, even using the tick data. We see it as outside the United States as an important part of emergency financing, where you'll see repo volume skyrocket during periods where you wouldn't necessarily expect them to skyrocket because it's an indication of bad things happening in all of these hidden shadow parts that we can't see. So in the one sense, in the post March 2020 era, the fact that repo dollar volumes and collateral pledged has gone down is either, it's a sign that we're not in the same sort of emergency situation that we were beforehand. Again, you can see that last little spike up into February of 2020, which was everybody scrambling to get to arrange as much financing as they possibly could at the last minute before things really broke down. So the fact that it's come down a little bit is a good sign, but the fact that it hasn't come down more, maybe not necessarily a fully reflationary sign, like the collateral dispersion or lack of collateral dispersion that we saw in the other parts of the Triparty Repo data.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I highly encourage you to read these two articles. Again, you can find them on Alhambra Investments, both posted on the 1st of June. Both have quantum of money in the title. Jeff, is there anything that we didn't cover in this long episode and revelatory episode? We have presented two new measures that I know I'll be using to see where we are in our monetary recovery.
It's
anything
just
that you want to, yeah.
The overall point here, going back to Niels Bohr and quantum physics, is that this is a good tool to look at some of the things, but remember, we're trying to match this with, again, the totality of phenomena, which is all sorts of other things, including real-time prices. Why are treasury yields, why are T-bills, why are all these things behaving the way they are? And we put these things together, we start to get a more comprehensive, or what we hope is a more reasonable and comprehensive view of what must be going on in the shadow money system itself.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, take care, Emil.